Hello and welcome to another one of my videos. So for this video I actually selected like my top film picks from 1900 to 1904. So basically I decided to choose the one film I thought was the best out of all of them for each year. So with that being said, let's go ahead and begin. For 1900 I selected Georges Méliès's Joan of Arc. The thing about this film is that I like the fact that it depicts history and it's basically a biography. As I watched it, I kind of felt like this was the epic film of the era. I know today like epic films are kind of like 3 hour long films. Back then, films were still like 2 minutes long, and this one was like 11 to 12 minutes. So I thought it was an interesting film to watch given that Méliès has been trying so many different types of ideas. I mean, he did like horror, he did science fiction, he did fairy tales, and now here he is doing basically a historical biography. So this film actually covers the story of Joan of Arc from the time where Michael the Archangel visits her all the way down to the end of her life. So it was fun to watch. However, I will say that for this film, it probably, well, it definitely would help if you know the story of Joan of Arc, because this film, if you don't know the story, you're kind of left wondering what's going on in the scenes. So Georges Méliès, I think, could have probably have fixed that by maybe adding a little bit more to the scenes so that way he can kind of flesh out what's going on. So that way audiences would know, like, okay, so this is what's happening in this scene. But other than that, it was nonetheless still a fun little film to watch. In fact, this was Georges Méliès's second, like, great movie, or second movie that was just popular amongst people. The first one was Cinderella, which was released, or actually, yeah, it was Cinderella, released a year before. So, 1901, the film that I thought was the most interesting was Walter Booth's Scrooge, or Marley's Ghost. So, this film is basically an early version of A Christmas Carol, or an early film version, I should say. But unlike the book and later versions or later adaptations, Marley's Ghost is basically taken the role of the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. So I guess Walter Booth just didn't have the money or the time to really bring in all those other characters. Nonetheless, it was interesting to actually see like a classic story, like I guess the earliest adaptation of it. And it was interesting to actually see the ghost, because the ghost of Marley just kind of appears slowly out of nowhere, and you can really see like right through the ghost. That's not to say that the effects were perfect. There was like one scene where the ghost appears on a door and it just looks like someone filmed the scene and then later on they pasted an image of the ghost on the film. So probably not the best way to do that, but nonetheless it was nice to see this classic film. One thing I will say though is that this film does suffer from the same issue with Joan of Arc. It kind of helps to know the story of A Christmas Carol. Otherwise, you're kind of left guessing what's going on. I will say that this does use intertitles, so each scene you will see like a little bit of wording to let you know like what the scene is supposed to be about, even though you're still left wondering, well, okay, what's happening here? Um, and I'm thankful, however, over the idea that intertitles were not used throughout the film, because later film movies, you see them like every few seconds, and I honestly find that annoying. I would rather have a silent film without intertitles. In fact, I'd rather just be confused as opposed to reading throughout the whole film. For 1902, I selected Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon. Honestly, I saw a clip of this when I was a teenager. It was a clip where there was a rocket that got shot into the air and it crashes into the moon, and just it was kind of weird just looking at the moon. It was a funky way of showing special effects. I honestly thought it was kind of funny, and that's just been etched in my mind. So when I saw it the second time around, I was just like, hey, here's a classic image, and I really did enjoy this film. So this is a Méliès making another science fiction film. Basically, you have some individuals who decide to go to the moon, where they meet like basically moon monsters, and then they return to Earth. In fact, the ending kind of reminded me of the Apollo missions, because it essentially basically the rocket crashes into an ocean, and the rocket ends up getting retrieved by other people. So, fun little science fiction film to watch. 1903, I felt like the films were a little lacking, so it was kind of hard to select one that I thought would have been like the best representation for that year. But in the end, I ended up selecting George Méliès's The Enchanted Well. Overall, though, it doesn't really feel like it's much of a narrative. It was more like just a comedy skit, because what happens is this old woman ends up putting a curse on the well, and so all these weird things happen. It's basically a comedy film. And so the well ends up like moving around, it grows, it shrinks, things come out of it. In fact, at one point, you end up getting lizard men coming out of it, or frog men with, I mean, I can't really tell because they look like lizards, but they don't have tails. But essentially, it's just a simple, fun, like comedy skit. 1904 was another year where I kind of felt like the films were kind of lacking. In the end, I once again selected another George Méliès film. I selected The Impossible Voyage. Um, the only thing about The Impossible Voyage, though, is that it kind of feels like another version of A Trip to the Moon. The big difference, though, is that they go to the sun instead of the moon. I will say, though, that in this film, the film is longer, and George Méliès actually ends up putting a lot in his set design. Um, I mean, you when you look at the set design, it looks like, almost looks like it's animation. What they did is like they added cartoons to it, but that's not exactly what's happening. In fact, I'm pretty sure all those cartoony backgrounds are all props. So it's really interesting to see that he was able to really create these unique props that are really moving around. In fact, I almost feel like this film, the purpose of it was really for George Méliès to kind of show off his stage production. But other than that, in terms of story, again, not very original. It just felt like another version of A Trip to the Moon. So if you want to see like stage production, just how well George Méliès did after 2 years, an interesting film to watch. But in terms of storytelling, I kind of feel like A Trip to the Moon is a little more enjoyable. So overall, I do feel like looking at these films as well as other films during those years, it really felt a lot like a stage production. And it makes sense because back then, when you were going to get some entertainment, you would go to a stage play, and instead of a stage play, now you have film. But what you did is, instead of doing your stage play in front of people, you did it in front of a camera. The other thing I want to point out is as you watch this, I do feel like the actors are kind of exaggerating their acting, and it's understandable given the fact that part of showing off your skills is to, well, essentially you show your acting through the way you speak. And these are silent films, so you don't exactly have that capability. So you kind of have to make up for it. So in the film, you do kind of feel, I did feel like a lot of the movements, especially with their arms, was a little exaggerated. But again, given the period, it's kind of expected. So you probably did notice that most of the films, I mean 4 out of 5, I selected a George Méliès film. As I said in my previous video, if you really wanted to check out like early films, the most enjoyable ones, in my perspective, are those of George Méliès. But that's basically it, and I do want to thank you for watching my video.